When the wilderness turns silent, the unknown begins to move. From a peaceful family night in an Adirondack RV park shattered by something massive outside their trailer, to two firefighters hearing their own voices echoed back from the dark, these 6 encounters reveal how quickly calm can turn to terror when something unseen decides to come closer. On July 26, 2025, in a quiet RV park tucked deep in New York's Adirondack Mountains, the Novak family, Mike, Sarah, and their 2 children, Ethan and Lily, arrived just before dusk, tired from a long week and eager for peace. The air was still and heavy, the kind that carried the hum of insects and the faint rush of wind through endless trees. Mike set up the small grill by the trailer, flipping burgers while Sarah unpacked the cooler, and the kids laughed near the fire pit, tossing twigs into the growing flames. The sky dimmed slowly, the last streaks of orange fading behind the pines, and for a while everything felt safe, ordinary and good, the kind of summer night that settled quietly around them like a blanket. When darkness thickened, strange sounds drifted from beyond the tree line, long, uneven whoops that rose and fell like echoes of something trying to mimic an owl, though not quite right. They came in short bursts, then stopped, replaced by a deep quiet that felt heavier than before. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked, sharp and deliberate, but no one moved to check. The wind had died completely, and even the insects had gone silent, leaving only the soft hiss of the fire and the occasional rustle of something shifting in the forest. By midnight, the camp was asleep, the embers low, the trailer's small light glowing faintly through thin curtains. Fog drifted low over the ground, pale ribbons weaving between the trees. Around 2 a.m, the quiet broke. The first jolt came suddenly and hard, shaking the trailer from side to side with a deep metallic groan. Sarah woke first, heart hammering, as the walls rattled and the dishes clattered inside the sink. Another shove followed, stronger, making the whole structure creak and sway on its supports. Outside, branches cracked, snapping under the weight of something large moving fast. The sound circled the RV, thumps near the wheels, then heavy footfalls pacing slowly, methodically, as if measuring distance. Mike grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved toward the narrow window above the kitchen sink, his breath loud in the silence that followed the last impact. The beam cut through the fog, landing on nothing but pale mist and the faint outline of trees. For a moment it seemed over, until something pressed against the glass. A massive hand, black and caked with mud, slid into view, fingers wide and thick, nails dull and curved like blunt claws. The light caught the surface of the skin, coarse, covered in tangled hair, and the fingers flexed slightly, leaving streaks of wet dirt across the pane as they slowly dragged downward. Mike froze, unable to speak, watching the smudged outline smear the glass before the hand slipped away into the fog. Sarah clutched the children close on the bed, feeling the trailer tremble with each slow step outside. A hot animal smell seeped through the vents, heavy and rank like wet fur and rotting leaves. The breathing came next, deep, heavy, close, sniffing around the base of the trailer. The sound of air drawn in and released in long bursts, as if something was studying the scent of what was inside. Then came another push, gentler but deliberate, rocking the RV just enough to make the ceiling fixtures rattle. It stopped all at once, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt unnatural. They stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to move or speak, the children shaking quietly in their mother's arms while the first light crept pale and slow through the windows. When the sun finally reached the clearing, Mike stepped outside, the air cool and still. The scene around the campsite felt wrong, disturbed in ways that defied sense. The cooler had been dragged 30 feet away and opened, its contents scattered and rearranged in a crude circle on the dirt. Bread, half-eaten meat, fruit, all placed as if with intention. Around that strange ring, prints sank deep into the soft earth, massive human-like impressions at least 20 inches long. The toes spread wide and sunk deep, edges clear in the morning light. The awning was torn loose, one pole bent at an unnatural angle, and small tufts of coarse brown hair clung to the canvas. No one else in the park claimed to have heard anything that night. The other campers said the wind must have done it, that animals sometimes tore through camps looking for food. But the Novaks knew what they had felt, what they had heard: the rocking, the breathing, the weight of something immense circling the trailer. They packed in silence, hearts still pounding, watching the fog lift slowly off the ground as they hitched the RV to the truck and drove out through the narrow gravel road, the trees closing in on both sides as if swallowing the place behind them. For days afterward, Mike found himself waking in the middle of the night, certain he heard the trailer shift again. Though they were back home and parked on concrete, he began locking every door before bed, checking each window twice. Sarah washed the mud from the cooler, but the marks stayed faintly visible, as if the dirt had sunk too deep. Ethan started drawing the hand he'd seen on the window, the shape too large for the paper, the fingers too long, the nails black. No one spoke about what might have done it. They told friends it was probably a bear, though bears didn't leave prints like that or arrange food in neat circles. When Mike finally looked up the region's wildlife records, he found nothing to explain it. No bears that large, no primates in the area, no reports matching what they'd seen. Yet at night, when the house was quiet and windless, he sometimes thought he heard a low, distant whoop from the woods beyond their yard, faint and uneven, echoing through the still air like something trying to sound alive but not quite human. He never went back to the Adirondacks, and though months passed, Sarah sometimes found thin streaks of dried mud near the bottom of the back door, too high to be from shoes, too smudged to be fingerprints, as if someone or something had pressed there once and walked away. In the winter of 2024, the Montana Rockies lay buried beneath a dense veil of snow, the kind that muted every sound and softened the outlines of the forest until trees became only shadows in a white blur. 3 hunters made their way up a steep ridge that morning, their breath steaming in the freezing air, their boots crunching through drifts that reached their knees. They had come for elk, following faint tracks that wound through the pines and up toward the timberline, the cold biting at their faces and numbing their hands despite thick gloves. The wind was relentless, carrying the smell of pine sap, cold stone, and something faintly metallic beneath it, something they couldn't place. Carl, the oldest of the group, moved more slowly than the others, his pack heavy with traps and gear. He had hunted this ridge before, knew every bend and gully, but even he admitted that morning felt strange. The woods quieter than usual, the air too still between gusts, as if the forest were listening. When they paused to rest near a cluster of firs, he mentioned checking one of his older traps farther down the slope, promising to rejoin them in a few minutes. The others nodded and moved ahead along the ridge, snow thickening into a blinding curtain. Not 10 minutes later, a single sound broke through the storm, a heavy, deep thump, unlike anything natural, echoing across the ridge. It came once, then again, slower, as if something massive was moving through the snow below them. Then silence. The men stopped, listening hard, snow piling on their hoods and rifles. When they called for Carl, the wind swallowed their voices. There was no answer, only the groan of trees shifting under ice. They retraced their path, their footprints already half buried by fresh snow. Carl's last known spot came into view, a small clearing near the edge of a slope where the storm seemed to thin for a moment. His pack lay there, half open but untouched, straps twisted as if dropped mid-motion. His rifle leaned neatly against a tree, barrel up, not fallen or disturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken branches, but nearby, pressed deep into the snow, were footprints, bare, wide, enormous. The tracks led away from the clearing, each step twice the length of a man's stride. The toes spread wide, the edges sharp and deep from weight and heat. The hunters followed them in disbelief, pushing through drifts that swallowed their knees, their hearts pounding harder with every step. The prints descended into the tree line, moving straight and deliberate, and then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. There was no scuffle, no drag marks, no sign that the creature or Carl had turned back. The trail simply ended in a patch of untouched snow, as if both had been lifted out of the world entirely. The men searched for hours, circling the ridge until light began to fade and the storm worsened, their calls growing hoarse. They found no trace of Carl, no footprints of his own, no torn clothing, no sign he had moved beyond that clearing. When they finally gave up, their nerves were raw, the woods around them shifting in strange patterns of light and shadow. They felt watched. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the sound of distant movement, faint thumps beneath the snowpack, slow and steady, as if something enormous paced just out of sight. By the time they reached camp at dusk, both men were shaking, not from cold, but from the deep certainty that something unnatural shared the ridge with them. They packed their things in silence, the storm swirling around them, the forest pressing close as though urging them to leave. When they descended the mountain the next morning, the sky was clear again, but neither looked back. Search teams arrived days later when the weather allowed, scouring the slope with dogs and snowmobiles. They found the same footprints frozen solid into the ice near the tree line. Investigators noted the lack of blood or signs of an attack, speculating that Carl had fallen into a hidden crevasse or wandered off disoriented. Yet no sinkholes, tracks, or personal belongings were ever recovered. His disappearance was quietly filed away as a presumed accident, though no one could explain how a man could vanish in open snow, leaving his rifle and gear behind, as if he had simply stepped out of himself. Locals still talk about that ridge, especially in winter when the snow grows thick and heavy. They say the woods there shift when you stare too long, the trees seeming to lean closer, the wind carrying a low hum like something breathing beneath the earth. Some hunters claim to have heard slow, distant thumps echoing after fresh snowfall, rhythmic and heavy, fading when approached. Others say they've seen wide shapes moving between trees, too tall, too broad, too quiet. No one hunts that slope anymore after a storm, not since Carl vanished. The ridge remains still now, buried in silence, its secrets frozen beneath the snow. And when the wind rises, carrying through the valleys below, it brings with it faint echoes, slow, heavy, measured, like footsteps moving somewhere high above, pacing the same ground where a man once walked and never returned. On September 14, 2023, the Swiss Alps loomed pale and immense above the quiet town of Grindelwald, their jagged ridges cutting through the thin clouds, their slopes dusted with early autumn snow. On a cold October morning, Lucas, an experienced trail runner in his 30s, set off alone from the valley floor, aiming to cover one of the steep mountain paths before dusk. He was confident and well prepared, his endurance shaped by years of alpine running, his small pack holding little more than water, energy gels, and a thin jacket. The trail began gently through the lower forest, where the scent of pine resin hung in the air, and the ground was still damp from the night's frost. Each stride felt effortless as he climbed higher, breath turning to mist in the crisp air, the world behind him shrinking into silence. By early afternoon, he had reached the ridgeline above the gorge, where the path narrowed to a ribbon of rock overlooking endless valleys. The wind carried a faint hum as it moved through the trees far below, mingling with the constant rhythm of Lucas's feet on gravel. He checked his watch, took a sip of water and pressed on, unaware that the weather was already shifting. In the Alps, fog could roll in without warning, sliding down from the glacier like a living tide, and within minutes the horizon was gone. The mist came fast and thick, swallowing the mountains in a dull gray wall. Trees faded into faint silhouettes, their outlines dissolving until they were part of the fog itself. Lucas slowed, scanning for trail markers, but the visibility had dropped so low that even his own footprints began to blur behind him. He tried to follow the faint curve of the path, but each bend looked the same, and soon he wasn't certain if he was still heading uphill or along the ridge. The only sound was his breathing, steady, measured, and the muffled crunch of shoes on cold rock. When he stopped responding to messages, his friends assumed poor reception. But as evening fell and Lucas still hadn't returned, worry turned to panic. Calls went unanswered and the local rescue patrol was dispatched before midnight. The first teams began climbing with headlamps and thermal gear, guided by GPS waypoints and fading daylight. The fog had thickened again, so dense that even flashlights could not penetrate more than a few meters ahead. One rescuer later said it felt as though the mountain itself was exhaling cold air, pushing back everything that tried to enter. At dawn, with visibility still limited, a helicopter lifted off from the Grindelwald base and began sweeping the ridges above the gorge. The pilot navigated carefully, eyes locked on the shifting mist ahead. For a brief moment, through a thinning gap in the fog, he caught sight of something standing near a cluster of rocks. It appeared upright, tall, unmoving, a vertical silhouette against the pale backdrop of cloud. He couldn't make out features, only the outline, broad shoulders, long arms, a stillness that didn't belong to wind or shadow. He banked the helicopter to turn back, but within seconds the fog sealed itself again. When he passed the same spot moments later, the ridge was empty. Ground teams reached that section mid-morning. They found Lucas's shoe prints first, clear, narrow impressions in the soft crust of snow, weaving slightly as if he'd been uncertain of his footing. But beside them ran another line of prints, far larger and deeper, the spacing irregular, each one shaped like a bare foot but elongated, the toes splayed unnaturally wide. The snow beneath each impression was compacted hard, as though something massive had stepped with controlled weight. The rescuers followed the trail in silence, their radios crackling softly. It led toward the gorge's edge, growing shallower near a flat outcrop where the wind whistled between boulders. There, abruptly, both sets of prints stopped. The ground ahead was untouched. No drag marks, no skid lines, no sign that anyone had fallen or turned back. Only a single strap of Lucas's pack hung from a rock ledge below, torn and frayed, the rest of it lying a few meters down the slope as if caught mid-descent and snagged by chance. There was no trace of him anywhere else. Rescuers scanned the gorge with binoculars. When the search concluded days later, the official report was brief. It cited disorientation in heavy fog, probable slip or fall, noting that unstable terrain and poor visibility made recovery impossible. The pilot's sighting was omitted, filed only as a passing visual anomaly caused by refraction and depth illusion in high-density mist. The deeper, barefoot impressions were described as melted tracks from inconsistent snowpack. No one argued publicly, though privately several members of the rescue team disagreed. The prints had been too defined, too deliberate, too far apart to belong to any animal or melting snow. In Grindelwald, people talked quietly about the disappearance. Some said Lucas must have wandered too close to the gorge's edge and fallen through the fog. Others claimed that part of the ridge had always been wrong, that the weather changed there too fast, that echoes sometimes returned late or distorted, as if bouncing off something that wasn't stone. Climbers began calling the stretch der Atmende Grot, the breathing ridge, because on still mornings the mist there seemed to rise in slow, pulsing columns, expanding and collapsing rhythmically like the lungs of something asleep beneath the earth. That winter, several hikers reported strange sensations near the same path. They described sudden silences where the wind should have been, and faint, heavy thumps that vibrated through the ground like a heartbeat underfoot. One pair of mountaineers claimed to have seen movement through the fog, something tall and motionless standing between trees, vanishing before they could focus their lamp. None of them went back. The area was eventually fenced off after repeated incidents of disorientation among visitors, though no further disappearances were recorded. By spring, Lucas's family placed a small memorial plaque near the base of the mountain trail, a simple metal plate engraved with his name and the date he was last seen. Hikers sometimes stopped there, noting how the fog gathers differently around that point, swirling in slow spirals before dissolving into the valley. Locals avoid it at dawn when the mist is thickest, and say that if you stand quietly, you can hear faint breaths moving through the air. Not wind exactly, but something heavier, deeper, like an enormous chest rising and falling behind the cloud. No remains were ever found. The snow melted and refroze, the footprints disappeared, and the ridge returned to silent. Yet even now, when fog drifts down from the glacier in long, rolling waves, some who look up from Grindelwald claim they can see shapes shifting in it, tall, pale silhouettes half hidden in the gray. standing still for seconds before fading back into the mist that swallows everything it touches. On August 30th, 2018, Daniel Porter drove deep into the Oregon Cascades, following an old logging road that twisted between dense stands of fir and hemlock. He was 32, an experienced hiker who had grown used to solitude, often vanishing into the mountains for days at a time. That week he had told a friend he wanted quiet. No phone, no noise, just the sound of wind and water. His plan was simple. One night in a small clearing he'd marked on his map, then a long hike back down the next morning. The weather had been fair through most of the day, warm and still, with blue haze clinging to the higher ridges. But by late afternoon, the air shifted. A cold wind moved through the valley, and the light dimmed faster than usual. The mountains seemed to fold in on themselves as fog began to rise, thick and milky, spreading low across the trees. Daniel reached the clearing around dusk and pitched his small tent beside a patch of moss-covered boulders. The place was silent except for the faint hiss of wind through the branches, a hollow sound that seemed to echo without direction. At some point after nightfall, his phone lost signal completely. He made no further calls or messages. By morning, when he failed to check in, a friend contacted the county sheriff's office. Search teams were sent in by noon, guided by coordinates from his last phone ping near a forgotten service road leading toward the clearing. When the first rescuers arrived, they found his car pulled neatly off the track, keys still in the ignition, as if he'd expected to be gone only a short while. A narrow trail led upward through the fog. The air was heavy, damp, and cold enough that every breath hung visibly. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insect, not even the distant trickle of water. They reached the clearing just before sunset. The tent stood upright in the middle of it, zipped closed and perfectly intact. Nothing appeared scattered or broken. But when they called his name, there was no reply. Inside, Daniel lay curled on his sleeping pad, as if he had simply fallen asleep. But his face was pale, his skin faintly marked with small abrasions along his arms and neck. His clothing was torn in several places, though not shredded. It looked more like he had struggled briefly, perhaps against fabric or something coarse that had caught him. The rescuers paused, uncertain. There were no signs of a fall, no blood, no weapons, and no evidence of an animal entering the tent. The dirt floor inside was dry except for the faint smudges where Daniel's boots had been. Near his body, however, the surface showed something else. Large, bare impressions in the packed soil, uneven and deeply pressed, looping once around him before stopping near the tent's inner wall. The prints were broad, almost double the size of a man's foot, and oddly spaced, as if whatever made them had moved on two legs, but with an irregular gait. Daniel's flashlight lay across one corner of the tent, its casing cracked and lens shattered. The tent fabric itself showed several faint scratches from the inside, short and angled, as though something had brushed or dragged along it from within. But there were no claw marks, no rip, no sign of entry or exit. Outside, the rescuers spread out through the clearing, looking for other tracks or signs of movement. The fog hung low over the ground, curling in slow, heavy waves. Around the perimeter of the tent, the ground was marked with the same wide footprints seen inside, but they led nowhere. Each set ended abruptly in undisturbed earth or moss. They called for backup, marking the site for investigators. When additional teams arrived, they found no signs of large animals in the area. No scat, no tufts of fur, no disturbed brush. Even the undergrowth seemed untouched. The forest floor around the clearing was eerily pristine, as if nothing heavier than mist had passed through for days. A medical examiner later reported that Daniel's injuries were superficial, small bruises and shallow abrasions, but inconsistent with a simple fall or natural cause of death. There was no evidence of suffocation or trauma. His body temperature and condition suggested he had died quietly sometime before dawn. Toxicology results were negative. One of the search team members, a veteran tracker, refused to return to that clearing after the first night. He told others that while he had been collecting samples near the tent, he'd felt the ground vibrate faintly beneath his boot, not like an earthquake, but a single deep pulse, as if something large had shifted weight nearby. When he looked up, he said the fog seemed to move against the wind, swirling in slow columns around the tree line. He thought he saw shapes within it, dark, vertical, motionless. But when he blinked, there was nothing. The official report classified the death as undetermined, possibly hypothermia or panic-induced heart failure. But among those who had been at the site, few accepted that explanation. The tent had been sealed from the inside, and the temperatures, though cold, were not fatal. More unsettling were the tracks, photographed and measured, but later deemed inconclusive, perhaps distorted human prints in soft soil. Yet those who had seen them firsthand said otherwise. The impressions were too clean, too large, too far apart to have been made by boots or by crawling animals. In the months that followed, hikers avoided that sector of the forest. Those who passed near it reported strange acoustic, the way sound carried oddly, echoing in short bursts before fading completely. Others described hearing faint thumps in the distance, slow and rhythmic, like something walking far below the surface. By winter, the clearing was buried under snow. The tent and gear had been removed, but the rescue team that retrieved them described how the snow seemed untouched, despite heavy storms in the area, as if the clearing itself resisted disturbance. Locals now call it the Silent Hollow. They say that in heavy fog, the place feels alive, that you can stand still and sense movement beyond sight, something watching, something testing the air. Hunters and loggers refuse to camp there. Those who pass by keep their voices low, claiming that even a whisper feels too loud in that stillness. On July 18, 2025, Samuel Sam Kellerman, a maintenance worker for the North Valley Freight Line, was assigned to inspect a stretch of track that cut through a remote canyon in western Montana. It was a lonely section bordered by dense pine forest on one side and a steep drop to a river on the other. The route was mostly used for freight trains, and by nightfall the rails gleamed faintly under a low fog that had rolled in from the valley. Sam had done this job for years and was used to quiet night, but the silence that evening felt heavier than usual, thicker somehow, as if the fog itself were pressing in against him. He walked slowly along the track, the beam of his headlamp cutting a narrow path through the mist. Every few steps he checked the rails for debris or loose ties, marking sections with orange paint when needed. The metal creaked faintly under his boot, a sound swallowed almost instantly by the fog. The air smelled of damp wood and rust, and somewhere far below the faint rush of the river could just be heard when the wind shifted. About half a mile down the line, Sam stopped. Something felt off. The fog had grown denser, flattening sound completely. He could no longer hear the river or his own echo. Ahead, maybe 50 yards away, he thought he saw movement, a tall, upright shape standing dead center on the rails. It was barely visible, more a column of shadow than a body, but it was there. At first, he assumed it was another worker checking the same line, maybe someone from the next shift arriving early. He raised a hand and called out, but his voice seemed to vanish in the mist. The figure didn't react. No answering shout, no wave, nothing. Sam frowned and took a few cautious steps forward. The fog swallowed the beam of his light as he advanced, diffusing it into a pale glow that illuminated almost nothing. He called out again, louder this time. Still no response. As he got closer, unease crept in. He noticed there was no headlamp glare reflecting, no high-visibility vest, no metal tools catching light. The figure just stood there, perfectly still, tall and dark, its outline wavering faintly in the shifting fog. He slowed his pace, keeping one hand near his radio. The gravel crunched softly under his boots. When he was within 30 feet, the shape seemed clearer. It was tall, far taller than any person he had worked with. Broad-shouldered, the head almost brushing the low drift of fog above the track. But there were no distinct details, no glint of eyes, no sound of movement, nothing that confirmed what he was seeing. Then he noticed the ground near his feet. Imprinted in the gravel were large, bare footprints, clear, deep, and oddly shaped. They were longer than his forearm, each one pressed flat with visible toes splayed wide. The stride was enormous, at least twice the length of his own steps, and the prints led directly toward the figure ahead. His breath hitched as he realized they simply stopped there, in the middle of the track. He took one more step forward, and the figure shifted slightly, as if the fog itself had breathed. Then it was gone. No movement, no sound, just gone. The space it had occupied was now empty, filled only with mist and the faint metallic glint of the rail stretching into darkness. Sam stumbled backward, tripping over a wooden tie and falling hard onto his side. His flashlight clattered against the gravel, rolling to a stop beside one of the massive footprints. Pain stung his arm where he'd scraped it against the ballast, but the cold that followed wasn't from the wound. It was the sudden realization that he was completely alone. The fog thickened, wrapping around him in heavy folds. He scrambled to his feet, breathing fast, scanning the trees that lined the right side of the track. For a brief second, he thought he heard a low sound, a dull, rhythmic thump, distant but deep, like the sound of a heavy footfall resonating through the ground. Then silence again. Only the fog moved, curling around the rails like smoke. He switched on his radio, voice trembling slightly as he reported seeing something strange near milepost 73. The dispatcher asked if it was wildlife or a trespasser. Sam didn't know how to answer. He said only that there were footprints, large ones, and that he wanted a backup crew to check it out. The dispatcher hesitated but agreed, sending a small team from the nearest yard. By the time the others arrived, the fog had thinned slightly, though it still hung low over the valley. Sam led them to the spot where he had seen the figure. The air was still unnervingly quiet. They found the footprints immediately, broad, barefoot impressions pressed deep into the gravel, leading up the track and then fading into the mist, ending mid-stride. The prints were unlike anything they had seen, each one uneven as if made by something massive but not used to walking on the ballast. The men fanned out, searching both sides of the track for signs of anyone or anything, but there was nothing. No broken branches, no discarded gear, no animal prints, not even a hint of disturbed soil beyond the rails. They checked the nearby riverbank with flashlights, their beams glancing off the fog and dying quickly. The surface of the water below was calm and dark. When the inspection ended hours later, the crew agreed to document the incident as unverified presence and unusual ground impressions. No one mentioned the height of the figure in the official report, but afterward, when the others had gone, Sam lingered by the tracks for a few moments. The fog had started to thin, revealing the faint outline of the trees above the ridge. As he turned to leave, he glanced once more toward the stretch where the footprints had been. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something far down the line, a tall silhouette standing beyond the reach of light. Then the fog folded back over it, and it was gone again. That section of track remains part of the regular maintenance route, but Sam never walked it alone after that night. Some nights, when the mist settles low over the valley, train operators claim to see shapes moving along the rails, tall and slow, vanishing when the fog lifts. On September 23, 2022, two off-duty firefighters, Mark Givens and Ryan Hale, drove deep into the New Jersey Pine Barrens, chasing rumors of an untouched fishing pond hidden beyond miles of overgrown trails. They were both used to long shifts, quiet nights at the station, and the stillness that followed chaos, so a weekend in the woods felt like peace. The sun fell behind the endless pines as they reached a small clearing just wide enough for their tent and folding chairs, the air heavy with the resin smell of needles and soil. It was late September, cool but not yet cold, and as dusk settled, the forest around them turned to shadow and silence, the kind that swallowed all distance. They cooked by lantern light, the pond just visible through the trees, a dark mirror reflecting the fading sky. Around them, everything seemed muted, the faint ripple of water, the occasional stir of branches. But beneath the quiet, the barrens had their own pulse, a soft rhythm that Mark couldn't quite place. By 10, mist was rolling low between the trunks, curling along the damp ground, and the only sound came from their small fire snapping and hissing in the night air. Then came the whistling. It started faint, somewhere far off, so soft they almost missed it. A slow, wandering tune, without pattern or melody, drifting through the trees. It rose and fell as if carried by the wind, though the branches around them were still. At first, Ryan thought it must be another camper, someone farther down the trail enjoying the quiet like they were. But the sound didn't fade or move. It lingered, too steady, too deliberate. When it stopped suddenly, The silence that followed seemed sharper than before. A minute passed. Then it began again, closer this time. The pitch was wrong, too low, and there was something almost human in it, yet not quite. It wavered like breath against a hollow tube, sliding between notes without rhythm. Then, without warning, the sound shifted. From deep in the trees came faint, broken words, mimicking something they'd said earlier that evening. Phrases repeated in the wrong order, warped and drawn out as if copied by someone who didn't understand the meaning. The voice was slow and heavy, repeating syllables out of sequence, a garbled echo of their own laughter from hours before. The fire crackled, but the forest had gone completely still. The pond, only a few yards away, was black and motionless, its edge shrouded in mist. The two men scanned the tree line with their flashlights, beams cutting through thick air, but the light seemed to vanish before reaching the trees. Then came the sound of footsteps, wet and heavy, dragging slightly as though through soaked leaves. They were slow at first, deliberate, and then quicker, uneven, circling somewhere beyond the tent. Mark caught movement, just a flicker, a suggestion of something between the trunks. He swung his light toward it. For a split second, the beam caught two pale eyes high above the ground, reflecting like glass. They hovered motionless, far higher than any person could have been, then blinked once, dull and slow, before slipping out of view as the footsteps retreated fast into the woods. The whistling returned briefly, this time low and fractured, before fading into the distance altogether. They stayed awake until dawn, the fire burning low, neither of them moving much. Every so often they thought they heard the faint whistle again, far away, but never close enough to tell for sure. The air remained unnaturally still, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. When sunlight finally reached the clearing, the fog lifted slowly, revealing the pond in full, the surface calm and glassy, the far bank lost in a thin gray haze. The forest looked normal again, ordinary even, though both men felt something was wrong. The earth around their camp was damp and scattered with leaves, but just beyond the tent, by the water's edge, was a single footprint pressed deep into the mud. It was bare and wide, the toes spread unnaturally far apart, each one defined in soft ridges of clay. It measured almost 15 inches long. Nearby, they found a small pile of smooth river stones stacked neatly in a short column beside their bait box. The box itself had been emptied, its contents gone, but the stones were placed so carefully it looked deliberate, arranged with purpose. There were no other prints, no sign of animals, no disturbances around the fire or tent. The forest seemed untouched except for that single mark in the mud. They broke camp quickly, packing in silence, avoiding the tree line as much as possible. Neither wanted to mention what they had seen, the eyes, the mimicry, the sound of their own voices drifting through the trees. They followed the overgrown trail back to their truck, glancing behind them every few minutes, though nothing moved in the forest that morning. The pines stood straight and tall, shafts of light cutting through their trunks, and yet both men felt they were being watched until the road appeared again. Later that week, they filed a short report with the local ranger station, listing only possible trespassers and unusual sounds. The ranger shrugged it off, saying the Pine Barrens had a long history of strange stories, lights, echoes, odd tracks, but that nothing ever came of them. He mentioned almost offhand that a few hikers had also reported hearing whistling out there in recent years. Most assumed it was wind moving through the pines. Mark and Ryan didn't return to that pond. In the weeks that followed, each mentioned hearing faint whistling at night while lying awake, just a few notes, low and wandering, coming from nowhere. It always stopped when they turned on a light.